As Sarah said at the top of the call, my name is Jeff Pallay, and I'm Ballotpedia's editor-in-chief. And I'm really excited to welcome you all to Ballotpedia Insights, a regular Q&A speaker series with political and legal scholars, researchers, reporters, and subject matter experts. Each installment, we host a new speaker and ask them tailored questions designed to gain an in-depth insight into their work. And I'm thrilled to have Salena Zito and Brad Todd on with us today to talk with us about their recent book, The Great Revolt. Our staff recently read that book, and to that end, we've prepared some questions that will drive the conversation. And as Sarah mentioned at the top, please use the Zoom webinar function to ask your additional Zoom questions if you have any, and we'll try to get to them at the end of the call. So I'm going to introduce our guests, and then I'll hand it off to Sarah Rosier, Ballotpedia's news editor, to facilitate the rest of the call. So thank you again, Salena and Brad, for being here today. Salena Zito is a lifetime resident of Pittsburgh and a Pulitzer Prize-nominated journalist. Her column appears weekly in the New York Post and over 90 other newspapers around the country. After the 2016 election, Zito was hired as a CNN contributor and as a writer for the Washington Examiner. Zito also hosts a weekly show on Sirius XM Radio, Main Street Meets the Beltway. Thanks for being here today, Salena.
Hey there, thanks for
Brad Todd is great. Brad Todd is a sixth-generation native of rural East Tennessee and an award-winning Republican ad maker and strategist. He is the owner of the firm On Message Inc. and a guest analyst for Meet the Press Daily. Brad and Salena collaborated to write The Great Revolt inside the Populist coalition Reshaping American Politics, a new book published by Crown Forum that has earned quick praise from CNN's Jake Tapper to the Wall Street Journal. The Associated Press writes people struggle to understand what's happening in American politics. Would do well to read this fascinating book. And so thank you, Brad, for being here today.
Thanks a lot.
All right, and I'm going to hand it over to our news editor, Sarah Rosier. Sarah has worked on several projects for us at Ballotpedia during her time, including Congress and our presidential coverage. And under her direction, Ballotpedia published a daily presidential briefing and covered the presidential party convention's delegates and expanded our overall federal election coverage. So thanks for facilitating the call today, Sarah, and I'll hand it over to you now. Looking forward to the conversation. Sarah?
All right, let's get things kicked off. So like I mentioned earlier, if anything pops up, we will be reviewing questions before we ask them. But a lot of these questions today were submitted by our Ballotpedia staff. So we've started a new tradition at Ballotpedia staff to pick certain on-topic books to read. And this was among the first we chose as a group to read together, discuss, and it brought up such good discussions that we were really excited to have Salena and Brad join us today for this. So thanks again for coming, guys. I want to start off with just a very basic one. What was the most challenging part of the research and the writing process for this topic as compared to other projects you've worked on in the past?
The most challenging part, I think, was pulling it all together. There are so many great stories and trying to decide which ones would make the cut and which ones wouldn't. I interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people across the Great Lakes states. So for me, that was the biggest challenge.
I think settling on locations, you know, we ended up, the book is set in 10 different counties in the 5 states that switched from Obama to Trump, and it's all 10 of the counties switched from Obama to Trump. I think the process to get to which places to go to find these people was probably a challenging part. And the way we did it, we started out, divided every county in the whole country by size, like size, into population tiers. This is in the appendix. You can see the election results by these population tiers. And then we went to these 5 states and looked for counties that had switched, but we also wanted to make sure we had a wide variety of counties from different population tiers. I mean, much of the story of this new coalition is in counties that are under 50,000, but that's not all of the story. And so we wanted to make sure that we just didn't end up writing a book about 10 small counties, in the Midwest. We wanted to have a good cross section. You know, you have Macomb County, which is a suburban county of Detroit, Kenosha County, which is sort of an exurb of Milwaukee and Chicago in Michigan. And then you have some small cities like Erie and Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. They're cities of their own right and therefore have their own sort of suburbs. And there's some small town counties like Keokuk, Iowa, and then some rural counties like Lake County, Michigan, Howard County, Iowa, and Vernon County, Wisconsin. So we ended up with a pretty good cross section, I think, and I think it helps you understand the story of what happened in counties in other places, even outside these zones based on the density.
Great, thanks. Brad and I chatted a little bit yesterday, and I was starting to tell him about, we had this internal first book club meeting about the Great Revolt a few weeks ago. And a very interesting part of that ended up being that a lot of our staffers, regardless of who or even if they voted in 2016, could see some aspects of their personality in these different archetypes. So I'll go to Brad first and then Salena. Which one was your favorite to cover and write about, and which one interested you the most?
I think the rotary reliables interest me the most, probably because, I mean, in some ways they shouldn't, right? Because they're pretty Republican people, pretty conservative people. But what interested me is it is a window into the fact that educational density played a huge role in how you voted in 2016. It's not whether you have a college degree as much as it's how many of your neighbors have college degrees. And do you interact only with people with college degrees, or do you have a pretty educationally diverse group of friends? If your friend group is not very educationally diverse, you probably vote for Hillary Clinton. If your friends are educationally diverse, you probably voted for Donald Trump. That's a broad generalization, but the rotary reliables archetype really led you to that answer. And you know, I know there's data-loving people on the call here in the audience, and I'll give you another piece of data that's not in the book on the subject. We sorted every county in the country based on educational density, right? And it's 29.8 was the average for 2016 for a county for college attainment, 29.8% bachelor's degrees. And so we put every county above 29.8, we call those sheepskin counties. You take every county below 29.8, and we call those deerskin counties. And I can get away with that because I'm from Roane County, Tennessee, and it is a deerskin county, right? So and if you look, it would be no surprise to the viewers today and listeners that, and again, this comes from an 8-state post-elect, 8 target states post-elect survey taken right after the election. In the sheepskin counties, Donald Trump lost college graduates by 19 points. If you move to the deerskin counties, Donald Trump actually won college graduates by 1 point. And you see a similar 18, 20 point gap among non-college grads based on the density of degrees in their home county. So what that tells us is it's not so much do you have a college degree, but do your neighbors have a college degree? And most of those people in the Rotary Reliable class, they had some qualms with Donald Trump, but much like their college classmates who lived in the suburbs did. But they were much more free to vote for him socially because they were interacting every day with folks without college degrees who were excited about Donald Trump. So to me, that was the most interesting one because it sort of led to something counterintuitive in a finding.
It's really hard for me to answer that question because I sort of fell in love with all of them because they all brought very unique qualities and really unique different points of view, but also a very common point of view, and that was the aspiration part, right? Like they all had, no matter how many struggles they've had in their lives or how many struggles their community has had, they all had this unifying thought of, you know, being part of something bigger than themselves and feeling better about the country. One of the most interesting things in the survey that Brad did was that 84% of the Trump voters felt very good about their personal futures, right? About how their lives were going, but they were most concerned about their communities. And because I was in all these communities, I didn't fly to them, I drove through them, and I didn't take an interstate, and I got to see, you know, sort of the carnage that the president talked about in some of these areas. I understood how they felt. But if I had to pick one, I'm going to pick two. That would be girl gun power. These were suburban female Trump, self-identified Trump voters who believed that the Second Amendment was like a very important core to what they were voting for and the protection of that. And these are women that are mostly, not mostly, but a lot of them are college educated. They have a stable life. They're mostly married and they're under the age of 45. And, you know, and they view themselves as feminists. And they viewed that personal empowerment, the ability to protect themselves, was one of the most important things to them and their families. And so I just thought I would see them in 2016, and Brad and I would discuss it back and forth. I'm like, yeah, there's something going on here with women that we aren't noticing, even though Hillary did her best ads, I think, against to draw those women in. And so that, and also the blue collar voters. I grew up in Pittsburgh. I still live in Pittsburgh. I'm never leaving Pittsburgh. These are the people that I grew up with. These are my uncles. These are people that, you were in Pittsburgh, you're sort of born a Democrat, right? And you get the voting card when when you get your baptismal certificate. And so for them to leave the Democratic Party it's sort of like leaving your church or your religion, or not liking your high school football team anymore, where you spent every Friday. This was a very, personal decision to make. So for them to leave their party and vote for Trump and become part of this populist conservative coalition, I think really warrants understanding what's going on in the country. People dismiss it. They say, "Oh, they're old, or they're bigots, or they're
angry."
Angry.
Yeah.
They're the least angry people I met. The woman that opens up the book, you read the book, Bonnie Smith, right? I mean, she worked for 32 years as a deputy sheriff. She was born a Democrat, as she said. She's a child of Democrats, a grandchild of Democrats. She worked for Democrats. She was married to a Democrat. She voted for Obama twice. She voted for Bernie Sanders. And then she just looked around one day and said, "I'm done." That took and she felt good about her life. She's not angry, but she felt good about her life. She was really worried about her community. It should be. Ashtabula, Ohio.
Same population today as it had in 1970.
Well, the rest of the country's grown by what, 50?
40%.
Yeah, almost 50%.
Right. Yeah. That the Rust Belt discontent that you both pull out in the book is just fascinating to watch, and part of that has to do with the unfavorability of both of these candidates. I feel like that was a common narrative throughout 2016, was you either love them or you hate them. Can you talk a little bit about how the unfavorability of both candidates played into the
and candidates who were unfavorable, voters who reviewed both candidates unfavorably broke sharply to President Trump. And some of that is the 8-year effect. Some of it, I think, is the notion that some of those voters hate both parties. And they viewed him, even if they had things that they had qualms with him. And of course, a lot of the people in the Trump coalition have mixed feelings about President Trump, had him as a candidate, have him now. However, they felt that the alternative of sort of allowing the same cadre of people in both parties to run the government, who had been running the government, was unacceptable. I missed some things about Donald Trump, especially in the primary phase. I thought, this is a protest movement. The voters are going to get it out of their system in the primary, and then they'll settle into a more plausible, nominee. All those crazy things I said them. They're all still out there. But it's I was wrong about something. When Donald Trump said things like, I might run third party. I'm not going to sign this loyalty pledge. These debates are rigged. The delegate system is rigged. I heard that at the time of, man, this is a guy who's not trying to unite the party. How's he going to ever pull this thing together after the convention is over with and unite the party? What I missed was that was a risk for sure, but that risk was balanced by the fact that he was marketing to these voters who don't like either party. And some of them didn't like him or her, by the way, but he was marketing that, I'm not crazy about this whole system. And I'm not sure that the Republican Party ought to get in charge of anything any more than the Democratic Party would. He was broadening the coalition, the potential coalition that was available to him. And after the last two losses in 2008 and 2012, plenty of Republican smart guys and women have sat down and said, oh, the Republicans have to broaden their coalition. They have to get new people and different people. He did. Donald Trump did. He brought new people into the coalition. It wasn't the people that the smart crowd had predicted would be the way to broaden the coalition, but he did broaden it. And so I really miss that sort of marketing toward that part of the middle. I think sometimes in American politics, we talk about the middle as if it is, the definition of the middle, if you ask most national political analysts or reporters, would be, oh, they're going to be socially liberal and fiscally conservative. Well, some people in the middle are socially liberal and were socially conservative and fiscally liberal. And Donald Trump brought those people into the party, sort of cultural conservatives, not opposed to big government. And so therefore kind of down on both parties, just like the other independents are.
Yeah, the descendant of the New Deal Democrats.
Right.
Yeah, fascinating. And that idea of he wasn't playing to the party base, he was playing to this populist base. I think last night in Minnesota, Tim Pawlenty said something to that effect, like, no, I'm not a Trump Republican. I didn't do well in this new era of Trump. And I think that almost gets to exactly what you were just saying, Brad, this new populism within the Republican Party and what that means for these primaries going forward. So along these lines and these comments Trump has made since the day he announced he was running to the most recent Omarosa comments, we hear critics of President Trump and also his supporters saying that he could probably get away with anything. From your interviews and research for this book, do you observe any core issues that would cause Trump to lose his base of support, or what could you imagine being a catalyst for a loss of support with his strong core base?
There's a great quote from Ed Harry in the first chapter. He's part of the blue collar voters, blue collar red-blooded. And he says, just let Trump be Trump, right?
I think oddly enough, and this would shock a lot of regular Republicans, I think if Donald Trump ever became a conventional Republican, his base would shrink.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's unnerving to some people who seek predictability in politics, and some of his unpredictability doesn't help him or Republicans. I mean, that's a straight up on it. But I think his base would shrink if he ever became really conventional.
Right, if he became part of the swamp.
Yeah.
If he becomes just like Mitch McConnell or Paul Ryan.
Just even you can even move right of that. I mean, I think conventionality is his enemy, because as soon as he becomes not different, he's going to lose a great number of people who distrust both sides.
And he does have good instincts in understanding that.
What do you think are the most conventional things he's done since taking office? Because
cut taxes. Across the board tax cuts is a pretty conventional Republican thing to do, and God created Republicans to cut taxes. So if he hadn't cut taxes, it'd have been a big mistake. But that's certainly conventional. I think that the way he's approached trade is viewed unconventionally, but anyone who is not in the sort of decision-making elite of America in both left and right would tell you that skepticism of multinational trade deals, that's pretty widespread now. Both the Democrat side and on the Republican side. The only people who are not skeptical of multinational trade deals are in the C-suites of corporations or in the environments of Washington, D.C. Out in regular America, most people are skeptical of multinational trade deals. I think 10 years from now, we'll look back at some of these things Trump has done and say, well, that was ahead of its time. A more aggressive posture on trade was ahead of its time. And sort of skepticism of NATO and UN, and that sort of rankles traditional Republicans now. And it makes some foreign policy hawks nervous. But I think in 10 years, we'll look back and say that turned out to be pretty conventional with where it was going.
I also think his embrace of the pro-life movement, even as someone who didn't begin as a pro-life personality, that he evolved into at least backing the pro-life movement. His speech in the Rose Garden on the day of the March for Life in January was very emotional, was very good. It's first president since Roe v. Wade was passed that spoke on the day of the march in the Rose Garden. And I think that is pretty conventionally Republican. I think his pick of the justices, both Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, are both very conventional Republican picks. His rollback of regulations at the EPA are also very, conventional Republican things that they do to make it easier for businesses to go on to the business of doing business, hiring people, opening up their stock.
Great. Yeah, I was going to bring up the Supreme Court and some of the federal court nominees. They do seem to be a core aspect of him taking advice from groups like the Federalist Society and some of his more traditionally conservative advisors. So yeah, that's a very interesting group of core things we could guess that a Republican president would do, and he is doing, compared to the other kind of things in his orbit the past couple of months. So one thing I want to talk about is this conservative populist coalition and what this could mean going forward. So how important is this coalition if Democrat turnout in 2018 or 2020 returns to pre-Clinton levels, even if it does not necessarily reach Obama level heights? With the narrow margins in some of these Great Lake states, could the coalition be offset by a Democratic candidate who has a higher favorability with this crowd?
I think that's a mixed. The answer is a mixed answer on that. You know, if you look at Michigan, for sure, Democrat base turnout in 2016 was not what it should be, and Donald Trump wins Michigan by 10,000 votes. Right? Wisconsin always has very high turnout. It had very high turnout in 2016. Was urban Milwaukee a little off compared to the rest of the state? It was a little off, not a lot off, but a little off, and turnout was still relatively high. But I don't think Wisconsin was that much of a fluke, even though he's the first Republican to carry it since 1984, because Republicans have been winning a lot of elections in Wisconsin, for Senate, for governor, for attorney general. So Wisconsin's definitely in a rightward trajectory on a long-term path. But I think you can say Milwaukee turnout mattered, and I think you can say Michigan turnout mattered. But if you look at Pennsylvania, and we go into these turnout statistics in the book, Hillary Clinton did just as well in Philadelphia as Barack Obama did. Philadelphia city turnout was up. Hillary Clinton had a huge turnout operation in Pennsylvania, and it worked. Her problem was she didn't come anywhere near Barack Obama's numbers in counties under 200,000. In fact, in most counties in Pennsylvania under 200,000, she polled less than Katie McGinty, who was the losing Senate candidate. And so she didn't even get all the voters who were willing to vote Democrat on that day in those smaller industrial counties. So, now, do those voters, was this all a softness on Hillary? That's certainly one theory. But I would argue that the Democratic Party today's brand is left of where it was on November the 8th of 2016. It has moved leftward. And so that leaves more people open in the middle than were even available to Donald Trump on November of 2016. So Republicans have a twofold task. They have to continue to move into these voters in the middle who've been left on an island by the Democrat leftward drift, and Republicans have to get their most marginal voters to show up. The people who don't like either party really are not Republican voters. They do like the president a lot more. We call them Peroistas in the book. Rough rebounders somewhat fit that as well. And so those Republicans have to motivate those Trump first voters, and also continue to take advantage of the fact that Democrats are moving leftward.
Yeah, and along those lines, within your group of respondents, you mentioned in the book that 77% of those you interviewed did not vote for Obama in either 2012 or 2008. Was that other 23 a high percentage of defections from previous election cycles?
Absolutely, it is. And we're in an era when it's become fashionable as political operative to say there are no swing voters left. It's just turn your base out. Which, by the way, is always the comforting thing to say if you're an ideologue, when most people who are in politics professionally are ideologues, right? It's much harder to say, let's go get some people who kind of disagree with us. It's a more difficult job, and it's much easier just to go fire at the people that agree with you on everything. And so in an era when we talk about, oh, there are no swing voters, I think you have to go look at the county level change you saw. In Ohio, there were 35 counties that swung 25 points or more between 2012 and 2016. 23 counties in Wisconsin were counties that Obama carried and Trump carried. 32 counties in Iowa. That's a third of the state were counties Obama carried and Trump carried. 12 counties in Michigan switched. So I think there was a real dynamic of swing vote. It was concentrated in certain kinds of places, right? The industrial Midwest and the rural Midwest really was the base of that swinginess of the election. But again, we're in an environment when we were told there are no swing voters. So I think 22% is pretty high.
How do you think it compares in those states compared to nationwide? What's your gut reaction there?
Well, I think certainly there are some places where it depends, right? In the South, the Republican vote has been pretty much maxed out, and it didn't swing because it already was that high. In the far West, Trump doesn't play as well in the far West for a variety of reasons, and so you saw Democrats actually gain. Hillary Clinton did better in California than Barack Obama had done. Hillary Clinton still wins California if you take out LA County, San Francisco, San Diego. I mean, she still wins even without all the margins she had in those places, in those large counties. So I think it varies by region. Some of the interior New England areas, Donald Trump also did better. Things swung closer to him, and of course, but it was centered in the Midwest. And there's a map in the back of the book that shows a heat map that shows the swing from Romney to Trump. And you can see that the darkest area, the highest level of volatility between those two elections is really centered around the Great Lakes, which is why we did the book there.
We just had a question submitted by Travis Taylor along this line. So you aggregated the data across the 5 states to show the similarities across the region. Within those states, what were the most striking differences, either in the survey data or the qualitative interviews, just from your gut reaction?
I'm not sure.
I would say within the states, I think that if you look at the states that have, I mean, the suburban mentality extends now even into around smaller cities even. One thing that has changed, if you look back 8 to 10 years ago, you'd have said, well, the suburbs of Des Moines are going to act like rural Iowa, and they're not going to act like suburbs. They're going to act like Iowa. And I think that is something that has changed. I mean, you could see slightly different attitudes in the suburban parts of these states in the Midwest compared to their rural counterparts. And literally not 10 years ago, we just said, oh, the only suburban effect you're going to get is in around very large cities. And I think that's a thing to watch for. Certainly Democrats are betting that that's the case in their efforts to take over the House, and that people can turn their skepticism in the suburbs about the president toward skepticism about a Republican congressman, probably who they voted for 7 or 8 times before in most cases. And so I think Democrats have made a very large bet on that, and I think you can see a suburbanization, if you will, of those areas. But it remains to be seen to me whether people who are for lower taxes, for an aggressive foreign policy, for vote on the economy, whether those people sort of leave all those 3 things in the garage and vote instead on the fact that they didn't like what was on the news that night. So.
Great, thank you. And this question's more for Salena and her methodology. So in the chapter where you're discussing how you found people, where you went, you say that you specifically avoided interstates and chain restaurants. And I think you mentioned that earlier on the call today. I'd be really interested in hearing more about why you avoided those particular locations. If you had gone to those places, what do you think you might have found different?
She's a glutton, that's why she avoided it.
The food's better at non-chain restaurants, right?
Well, my approach is that when you go to a small restaurant, I understand that chain restaurants in small towns are usually franchises and usually owned by small business. But the reason I try to go to a restaurant that's been, in a town for generations, these are typically the owners that understand the changes that have happened. And they can sort of help lead me to understand where do I go next. These are sort of the hubs, the center of town, and where I can find a diverse group of people that can tell me a little bit more about the town and help guide me on my way out. I avoid airplanes and I avoid interstates because you bypass things. When you take the back roads, not only do you get to obviously you get to your destination, but you see the different rings and changes around the community that tells you, oh my God, it's doing good, it's prospering, or look at these suburbs, look at these houses, or oh my God, these houses are falling apart, they look abandoned. There's all kinds of stories on the way to the place that I would miss in understanding what is happening in a region. So it's not just a town, it's understanding the region, the whole place, the whole identity of the place.
It sounds like it.
Parochial. They really identify with all aspects of their community. They're both proud of it and they're both worried about it. And that's usually the heart of any story about where people's political leanings tend to go.
Great, thanks. It sounds like it'd be really fun to take a long road trip with you. Maybe it might take a while.
Fly and meet her on the road, by the way.
Crazy. I'm driving to Mississippi today, so.
Oh wow, okay, that's a long trip. All right, great. So one of the survey questions that stuck out to us is, have you been hunting or fishing in the past 10 years? It seemed to differ a little bit in tone from some of the other questions asked in the survey. What motivated you to include this question in particular?
You know, if you've ever taken Charles Murray's "How Thick Is Your Bubble" quiz that AEI has on their website, which is fantastic. When we started the survey out, it had a lot of those questions. This is one of the only ones that survived on it. Would have loved to had 5 or 6 more sort of cultural habits questions on the survey. Would have been very interesting, but the survey was going to get too long, and we had to make tough choices about you know, how your opinions on policy versus some of your lifestyle choices. That one did turn out to be pretty interesting. You know, the lesser engaged the archetype in politics, the more likely they were to have gone hunting and fishing. So it did follow what you'd think, but it was just that was a bubble measure.
Great, yeah, with Robert Putnam and Bowling Alone, and that's such an interesting factor to think about hobbies as it relates to your engagement with your local communities. What kind of critiques have you received of the book and the subject? How do you respond to these critiques? Specifically, you know, a few articles we read talked about there being no mention of racial comments by any of the respondents. How do you respond to those concerns?
First off, everyone loves the book, so you should go get the book and buy it if you haven't already bought it. So like, there's no real critique of the book.
We're big fans here. So.
What did we talk about race? Race didn't come up a lot in the interviews with people.
And several of our people in the book have children that are minority that they have adopted. One adopted 11. Remember her? She was amazing. I just love people.
I would say, I mean, there were a couple of reviews that said the book didn't say that Trump's vote's all racist, right? Well, I mean, I think if you want to look at the Trump coalition and to have that be your conclusion, then you're going to stumble on the fact that a whole lot of these people voted for Barack Obama, and many of them voted for him twice. And so I guess I kind of reject that. I mean, I trust what people tell me when you ask them why did you vote for someone. I think you have to ask them, and you can judge their responses if that's why they voted for him or not. And so I think that's first. And I think second of all, we really focused in on places that switched from Obama to Trump. And we focused in on how is this different than the Republican coalition has looked before. And I think that our conclusions will take you to a place that'll examine is this realignment a factor of a lot of things? It's not just Donald Trump and what he said in his speeches, but this was coming for a long time. And Salena loves to say Donald Trump is not the creator of this coalition. He's the product of this coalition. And coalitions, politics is a game of tectonic plates, right? They continue to grind and grind and grind and grind and grind. Every once in a while you get an earthquake. And then when it's over with, nothing is where it was before. And you don't go back to where you were before. And I think it's our contention that the coalition alignment in American politics is now different. Maybe this was an earthquake because it was something very surprising and with far-reaching effects, but that doesn't mean it wasn't coming for some time. And that the plates are still moving. And that's why the Democratic Party today is further left than it was in November of 2016. And by the time we roll around to November of 2020, it's going to be further left. It's not going to stop moving left. It's going to keep drifting. And so I think that really our purpose in this was to examine this sort of macro structure. And the question we ask ourselves early is this the beginning of something, the middle of something, or the end of something? And I think our conclusion was it's the middle of something. So.
Salena, do you have any thoughts on that line of critique that's been used? against the Great Revolt?
I'm on the same page with Brad on that. It was not something that people brought up. It was not at all part of their decision making in coming to their conclusion. And I think it's 2/3 of the people in the book voted for Barack Obama. So to them, this was never an issue because, and they still liked Barack Obama. It's, you know, they liked him as a president. They couldn't stand his policies by the middle, some of them by the end of the first term, but a lot of them by, you know, the middle of the second term, like Cindy Hastings, right? She was like, Hutchins, she loved him. And then by the middle of the second term, she's like, yeah, this is not what I bought into. I like him. I don't like his policies. So, you know, there you go.
Interesting. So looking back and kind of the 2020 hindsight of all the policy initiatives and what's happened in the administration thus far, are there any questions you wish you would have included in the survey?
Well, you know, we listed 4 campaign promises that the president made and asked voters to rank them according to how important it was to their vote. By far, the lowest rated one was building a wall on the southern border. And I think that the first 2 years have been so dominated by discussion of immigration policy, and it has been such a large issue in Republican primaries and that I would, if I could do the survey again, I would have asked several more questions to probe that, because again, I take the voters in the survey's word that it was not as important as other things in deciding their vote, but it clearly has animated the first term. And so either the president believes it is important, more important than the voters believed it was in their decision to vote for him, or the voters have, it's become more important over time, and maybe that it may have become a proxy for whether you're against the establishment or not. I'm not sure, but I would like to, if I could go back in time, I'd ask more immigration questions on the survey.
I'm happy. I you know, I mean, we worked so hard on this book, and you know, people warned us it would be such a great challenge for 2 people to work together, but I couldn't have worked with a better person, and I couldn't have had better experiences in understanding what we initially saw in 2016, and I feel honored that I was able to go back out and explore that and understand it and bring these stories to life and help people, like, most importantly, help people understand this. And I feel like we accomplished that with this book, and I'm just going to be a little bit proud right now of what we did. Humble proud, but a little bit proud.
Nothing wrong with that. So Brad, Rob Oldham, one of our staff writers, asks, what questions specifically would you be most interested in about immigration? How would you delve deeper with this group into that topic?
Oh, that's a good question. I probably would ask, that's a good question. I probably would ask their perceptions on whether they think whether they're more likely to think Republicans are keeping their word on immigration, and you know, would you be willing to accept any sort of agreement with Democrats if the president says it's okay? I think one of the things that has fascinated me since then is when the DACA debate was going on, it appeared that the president and Chuck Schumer were about to come to a deal on DACA for wall funding. What I saw in Republican primaries is most Republican primary voters were totally okay with that. And yet, if you'd asked them in the pre-Trump era, would you be okay with DACA, they would have been unfavorable with the DACA deal. But because Trump was going to bless it, in many ways, it's like a Nixon to China deal, is my theory, that if he says it's okay, it must be okay. You know, because he's been such an immigration hardliner that this must be a good deal. So I think I would probably try to explore what kind of agreements that would be they could accept.
Fascinating. Another question, where did the voters that you surveyed or interviewed get their information about the candidates? Did you feel it was primarily social media? Was it cable news? Where were they getting their information?
I can tell you where they didn't get it, and that's from print media. You know, if you want to hear them, I mean, universally they would all rail on print media. Their local print media, the national print media, and Salena's a print media reporter, so I'm going to give her a pass on how to answer this question. But without a question, social media is the driver. And of course, you know, the New York Times admits that the #1 way New York Times content is consumed is on Facebook. And not in its own print edition, not on its own website. But so, I mean, Facebook does drive the conversation in other social media platforms. You know, I always joke with my clients, like the only thing bigger than Facebook is the internet. You know, and so therefore, you know, failing to understand what your Facebook strategy is and how other people interact on Facebook is a failure to understand how people interact. I think there's no doubt that social media is playing an ever increasing dominant role. But I think you can't just say, oh, this is just people talking to each other. A lot of times it's people sharing professional content with each other. And I think that's share on their own.
Great. Salena, do you have any thoughts on that from your discussions with them?
No, I totally agree. I mean, my industry is in really dire straits. And social media and Facebook is the platform for which people, that's where they get their news. Twitter as well, but I don't think as much with Twitter.
You're a complete political junkie and you're seeking it out if you're on Twitter.
Exactly. Facebook is a completely, much more of a community thing. Mm-hmm. Twitter is more of a bubble thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that tracks well with my gut reaction to those two platforms. So
reporters, like, you know, fighting back and forth with each other, right? Or pilfering.
100% of Americans are not on Twitter, but 100% of journalists are on Twitter.
Exactly.
So.
That's fair. And a lot of the journalists are just posting about their dogs, so it all evens out.
I post about my cats.
Yeah, that's even better. So, turning a little bit to 2018, what participants in these coalitions do you think will turn out in support of Republicans in 2018? What coalitions do you think will start to fail to turn out compared to 2016, or either lose interest or revert to Democratic support? Which are the most strong coalitions you see heading into 2018 versus the weakest?
Well, I'll take this first superficially, and then I'll let Brad take it into the deeper dive. I think where we'll see evidence of the Trump, well, first of all, just because a coalition loses doesn't mean it isn't still there. So I think that's important to note. But I think where we'll see the biggest evidence of the Trump coalition that began to form before his election in 2016 in the Senate races. You've got, what, 10 Senate races in Trump states where he won anywhere, was it, West Virginia, like 40 percentage points?
Yeah,
to
almost
20,
unanimously.
Yeah. So a Republican contender in any of these states, like Missouri or North Dakota or Indiana or West Virginia, I mean, they could get 10 less points than Donald Trump and still win by 10 or 12 points. So I think that's where you'll see a bigger evidence of the Trump coalition and how it stays together in a whole state. House races are different because of the way they're all divided up. I'm not convinced that there's a total blue wave yet. I think I'm the only living human being that isn't. You know, I could see on election night 2018 where Democrats gain just enough to either have a one vote majority or the other, or they leave, you know, one on the field. The Republicans have a one person majority. Or there could be a big wave. I don't feel the big wave yet, and I'm out there all the time. But yeah, they're definitely going to gain seats, for sure. I just don't know that they win the whole majority yet. Ask me that again in a month.
You know, I think Democrat turnout is going to be very high, especially in the urban areas and the suburban areas, but they can only vote once. And Republicans tend to vote in midterms. And so does the Democrat increase enthusiasm, does that put the both parties basically at parity for the midterm election or for turnout levels, or does the Democrats get an advantage? They'd have to go pretty good ways to get an advantage. I think in addition to just Democrats being interested, you'd have to have some Republican depression. I don't see any signs of Republican depression right now. I think the bigger challenge for Republicans is how do we win over enough independents to win, because Republicans typically do well with independents. we have to do well again. Independents tend to be part of brake pedal movements in the first term of a president's first midterm of a president's term. So we have to sort of make sure they don't end up being a brake pedal here, you know, on the president's agenda. Also, the House and Senate are very different animals for the reasons as Salena said. The Senate map is so contested in Trump country that if it is your theory that it's going to be a good Democratic night because it's going to be about Trump, well, that means it's going to be a good Republican night in the Senate, because the Senate races are almost all contested in Trump country. And even the one that's not, the one Senate race that's being contested in the state Hillary Clinton won is Nevada, which is a state she won by a very small margin. So you know, I think that Republicans in the Senate stand to gain seats. The question is it, you know, do they nudge upward one seat or could they gain more? It's important for Republicans to gain seats because in 2020, there'll be more Republicans playing defense than Democrats. And so ideally Republicans would like to gain, you know, more than a seat, gain 2, 3, or 4 to give themselves a cushion going into 2020. If that, and I think that's important for the president. The president needs to gain seats in the Senate because I'm sure he plans on being reelected right now. And if he does, he's going to have more than 50 votes to confirm his cabinet, to confirm his judges. And we see now the Democrats are just flat out not willing to help this president confirm even non-controversial nominees much.
I just, in terms of Senate races, there's a sleeper race that I think is really interesting, and that's in Michigan, between John James, Iraq and Afghanistan war veteran, served 8 years, small businessman, conservative, Christian, African-American, first time running, John James, and against Debbie Stamenow, who is an incumbent Democrat. This is her 3rd term that she's taking.
Elected in 2000 first. Okay. Yeah, after serving in the House before that since '94.
I'm going to keep my eye on this race. Here's why. In any of the races across the country that I have been covering, this is the race that has the most young people excited for Republican. When I go to his events, when I covered him, young people are volunteering, they're going to the events, they're really enthusiastic. I haven't seen that in any other race. And these aren't millennials, these are the Gen Zs. So these are the kids that are between the ages of 18 and 23. And I find that a fascinating aspect of this race.
Now, how would you respond to, I can see a number of pundits saying, well, look at the special elections like Ohio recently and those close margins there, or Connor Lamb in Pennsylvania. And these are, a lot of House districts are in these states that you guys were on the ground in. Was that just a fluke, or how does that work within this Great Revolt framework?
Well, I live literally across the street from Connor Lamb. I can see his house from mine. I live in the district. It was, you know, it was very specific to that seat, that loss. The Republican they picked, they didn't go through a primary process. It's a district that is a really interesting mix of suburban, rural, but a lot of the rural voters are blue-collar union Democrats who showed up very strongly for Trump. Unfortunately, and they showed up very strongly for the Republican that held that seat since 2002. The problem is the Republican that they picked is anti-union to run in this seat, and I think that made a really big difference in turnout for the Republican. I think the race ended up being by under 1,000 votes between the two gentlemen. And now the district doesn't even exist anymore. It's been all chopped up. Ohio 12, look, special elections to me are just that. They're special, they're unique. They're a test run. It shows you a couple of things, and to me, what it shows me and it shows Brad is Democrats are really excited to turn out. But I just think it's a hint of what might happen. I don't know if it's the whole story. Just remember, in 2006, all the special elections that led up to that November wave election year where the Democrats won everything, they won 30 seats, they didn't win one special election before that. Same with 2010. Republicans lost 7 special elections, 7 to Democrats. Everyone thought, they're not going to be able to pull it off. And then they go and win 63 seats. So I think there's hints, and I think there's information, but I don't know that it's a special election. It's a hot day and Tuesday. Nobody's used to showing up to vote on those days. So I'm not convinced it tells us the whole story.
One thing I would look at is in Ohio 12, Troy Balderson, the Republican, ends up getting basically the same vote share Donald Trump got within a point or two in every jurisdiction. The difference was that the Democrat jurisdiction turned out at a higher number than the Republican turned out in. I'm working in the Missouri Senate race, and you know, if we get the same percentage as Donald Trump in every jurisdiction, we're going to beat Claire McCaskill. We might beat her pretty bad. You know, so I would take that, and same Kevin Cramer in North Dakota, he would take that. He would take the Donald Trump percentage in every jurisdiction, and he'd win by a pretty big number. Same with Mike Braun in Indiana. Same with Matt Rosendale in Montana. And so I think that if you end up with that sort of environment where Republicans mostly get the Trump number and Democrats just merely their boxes turn out a little bit higher, that's a big loser for Democrats in the Senate. It might help them in the House. They might win the House control that way, but I think that's not a good enough outcome. And if I were running Democrat Senate campaigns, I would be trying to figure out how can I convince those people in the middle that I'm not an obstacle to the Trump agenda, because they're going to get their base no matter what.
Fascinating. All right, just one final question to wrap this all up. Do you think specific policies generally lead voters to Trump, or does Trump lead voters to his policies?
It's interesting.
This is an interesting question. Well, one of the things, a woman said this to me in Ohio 12 last week. I was in Zanesville. And she said, all my entire life, I have listened to candidates that have lured me by beautiful speeches, said beautiful things, and really compelled me to vote for them because of that. But I understand that there's probably about 13 to 14 people that massage those words to make it so perfect. And at the end of the day, I didn't get the results and the policies that I want. But with Donald Trump, I hate half of everything he says, maybe even more, but I'm getting the results and the policies that I want. So that doesn't answer your question, but I think that that's part of the nuance and understanding of what's going on in the heads of voters as they're deciding, do I want this? With this, I get that. Or am I going to go with this other thing where I'm not really happy?
I guess I'll start out with this. I think the number one issue that drives support for the president is a discontentment with the status quo and with the sort of the political system on both parties. I think Republicans feel that, and they felt that beginning since the Wall Street bailout happened in 2008. Republicans have been disenchanted with Republican leadership. And I think that plenty of people in the middle of independents who had hoped for Barack Obama and thought he would be a centrist president were disappointed that he was a liberal president. And so I think that there is a huge mass of people, a majority of the country, that has been disappointed with the people who are in charge. And I think that and also not liberal. I should say that if you're an ideological liberal, you're just not going to ever sign off on a Republican president at this point. So I think that that critical mass of people, Trump wasn't able to bring that group together, more based on what they've been unhappy with, rather than the things that he said he wanted to do. So I guess I'm answering that in the former sense, that sort of he brings people to issues rather than the other way around. Although I think you have to say that it's been fairly smart, and probably it's a product of one-party governance, that a lot of conventional Republican ideas have been put in place, even under an unconventional Republican president. So, you know, that I think you'll see more of that. It'd be interesting to see what happens if Donald Trump deals with a divided government. Does he continue to pursue conventional Republican policies or not?
Yeah, oh my gosh, that'll be something we'll be tracking after 2018 for sure. This was a really great discussion. There's so much here today. Thank you, Salena and Brad, for joining us. Can you tell the listeners where they can get the Great Revolt and how they can interact with you on social media?
Well, we have a website, greatrevolt.com, where there's the ability to get your book through Barnes & Noble, or through the independent bookstores, Books A Million, Amazon. You know, there's all kinds of variety of different.
But the links are all right there on the website.
Yeah, we made it really easy for you to just click and buy. You can follow me on Twitter at Salena Zito. There's a lot of family and cat pictures as well.
I'm Brad on message. And you also read reviews of the book on the website too,
Yeah.
greatrevolt.com. So.
Great. Well, thank you both for joining us today. And if you're listening and you'd like to follow along with what's happening in these coalitions and what we're seeing in 2018, head to ballotpedia.org and sign up for our news products and follow us on social media at Ballotpedia. So thank you again, guys, for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your summer.